Alright, hey everybody, welcome to my first part of the build log for my computer desk case, which is basically going to be a computer case built into a desk, and that's going to be a build that I'm doing because, well, my wife needed a new desk, and I was like, well, why don't I just build myself a nice desk that's the desk of my dreams, and then give her my old desk, because my old desk is still in good shape. It's not bad. It's a nice glass top, L-shaped desk. It served me well, but, kind of want to do something cool and unique, so that's why I'm going to do this. So what you're looking at here right now, this kind of hot mess that I've got going on, this is basically what I'm going to be using to conceptualize the build that I'm doing. So I'm just kind of doing this to see, kind of visually look and see how I can organize things. I did like a 3D model mock-up of how I wanted to build the desk, so I've got the construction part of it in my head ready to go, and that'll be fairly simple, and I'll videotape all that as well. But the thing I needed to really look at was how all the cables were going to fit, how everything was going to sit in there, and I wanted to make sure everything was sized right. So we'll start off by going over kind of a parts list of what I've got so far. So first thing I've got, which is already doing its job admirably, is I bought about 10 of these filters, and these are just fan filters that I'll be able to put basically anywhere that I cut a hole for a fan. I'll be able to put these over top of that, or maybe directly in between the hole and the fan itself, depending on how I mount it. And these will function perfectly for blocking dust from getting into the machine. So all my intakes, I'm going to try to do this so I have positive pressure inside the computer desk, but in case I don't do that perfectly, I'm going to put these anyway on the intakes, and that will prevent any dust from coming in from the intakes. And hopefully, if there is positive pressure maintained, that should push dust out. So no dust should be able to come in. Air just come through these filters into the case, and those are about $10 for a pack of 10, I think. So those were a pretty good deal. They also came with a bunch of screws, which I may or may not use. Just a big bag of screws for those, so that's cool. The next thing is I did buy, for about $9, I was able to pick up 15 standoffs for the motherboard and screws, 50 screws actually. These were $3 for this many screws. And I know if you look closely, they are machined screws for, they're meant for metal, but they will work just fine on this MDF that I have, especially because I'm not planning on doing a whole lot of, rough movement with it. Just like you wouldn't roughly handle a computer case, you're not going to roughly handle this that well, much anyway. So that's that part. I also bought a nice PCI Express flexible cable for my video card. So I'm not sure if I'm going to use it just yet. This isn't the ZAGG motherboard. I've actually got an Extreme or Asus Maximus 9 motherboard, which is really large but really cool, and it's got a lot of cool features, but it's kind of bulky, so we'll see whether or not I'm going to be able to fit the graphics card in vertically. If I can't, I'll be able to turn it horizontally like this, and that way the graphics card will be sitting up out of the way, and I'll be able to just mount that in there, and it'll be good to go. This is also not the graphics card I'm going to use. This is just a spare 1070 that I had laying around, which is close to the same dimensions as the 1080 that I have, but not quite. I did buy a brand new power supply, so I opted for a EVGA 750 gold quality power supply, and that's partly because of the high efficiency was the main thing. Is I need a lot of efficiency with the power supply in this, because this isn't a typical case. You're going to have to be a little bit more savvy with your heat management. So in the instance of this, we're going to have, I got this so that it could actually not run the fan sometimes. So this has an economy mode, and that will allow it to not spin the fan if it doesn't need to. So if it's not under a high enough load, the fan just stays off, which is actually really good for acoustics as well, because that'll keep it really nice and quiet, and prevent pulling more air in using heat. I know a lot of people out there are thinking, why not use a bigger power supply? For the system I'm going to be using, it does have a custom water cooling loop. It does have a 1080 in a ROG motherboard and all that stuff. And I think I've got two typical mechanical hard drives that are going to be in RAID 0 and a SSD. I've got a lot of stuff, but you know what, if you do the calculations for it, the power is nothing above about 500. So the peak power is around 550, I think. So a 750 watt power supply is more than enough for what I'm going to need. And really, if you just use like 1,000 watt power supply for everything, whatever wattage you don't use is actually just getting dumped out as heat anyway. So best thing to do, get the correct size power supply. Maybe give yourself a little extra room for expansion in case you wanted to add maybe another video card. But the way things are these days, it's not like the old days where your power supply was going to hinder you sometimes. It's really just as easy as you only need a 750 watt power supply. If you're going to do something crazy like have 3 or 4 Titans, you might want to upgrade to like 1,000 watt power supply. But anything above 800 is really probably overkill for just about any build out there. So that being said, I've got those pieces. I've also went ahead, and since I'm not going to have a typical front panel assembly like most cases where you'll have USBs and audio outputs and stuff, I just bought one of these, which was about 15 bucks as well. And this is just cut 2 USB 3s and 2 USB 2s, and then a microphone and audio output. And all this is going to be for is just for a front panel. I'm just going to lay this out in the front, and that'll be out in the front side of the desk, and it'll be available for use if I need it to. And short of that, that's about all the computer parts that I bought, I believe. The only other thing that I bought so far has been all the building materials that I need. So the first thing here is a piece of MDF. It's medium density fiberboard. This is good stuff for if you're going to build furniture, because if you're just going to paint it, it comes out with a great finish. It's also, you know, 100% smooth, so you don't need to sand it at all. You don't need to mess with it. It's just perfect, ready to go, and works great. It's also not going to bow or warp because it's actually a bunch of pieces of wood that have been essentially mixed together with glue and formed into this shape. If you use plywood, plywood can warp a little bit. It's usually not going to, just because of the way the plies are put together. But in the instance of this, this won't warp or bend at all. As opposed to these boards that I have here, which are going to be the size, those do have some bit of bending and warp into them. So just kind of have to be careful about that. But now, if you're completely lost as to how I'm going to do this, I'm just going to give a quick, brief visual explanation. So I've got a bunch of these 1x6 pine boards, and these are pretty easy and cheap to pick up, maybe depending on where you are. This is about 15 bucks for a couple feet of it, or not a couple. It's actually, I think, a 6 foot board. And what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to lay these around the perimeter of the MDF board, and these are going to form basically the walls of the desk. From there, once I have all 4 of them together, I'll have another piece of MDF, which I have over there against the wall, and that piece is going to sit on top. I'm also going to do a cutout in the top piece, which will be an inlay for glass that I'm going to have so that you can look in and see the motherboard working. Now, one thing that I should mention that I kind of forgot about for a second, if you don't have a motherboard that has a on-off button, like for example, this motherboard does have a power and reset switch built onto the motherboard, so you don't necessarily need the front panel connections to, you know, use a power supply switch from your case. You're going to need to get some sort of push button, and all the push button has to do is connect into the 2 pins on the motherboard that cause the power. You can get another one, do the same thing to reset. I wouldn't recommend soldering directly to the motherboard pins, but if you're real good, then yeah, go for it. I would actually recommend though is taking apart something like if you have a header riser that you can put all your pins on, that works great. Or if you have other older switches that have the little female adapters that can go onto the pins, that's probably your best bet. But you know, do what you want to do if you're going to do it that way. Just make sure you're safe about it. So I know a couple other things. I want to address a couple concerns that I know are going to be out there. So some people are going to say, where's your ground going to be? This is not a metal case. You have no ground. Well, that's not true, because that metal case that I have has no ground built into it either, because it's not grounded to anything. It's just a piece of metal. The ground is actually in the power supply itself. That's what the 3rd pin in between the 2 straight pins are, and that's what provides your ground. So everything here will be perfectly fine. Now you do need to be a little bit more cautious about static electricity and static buildup with this. So the only thing I can kind of give you to get away from that is to be careful. So don't put something like felt to line everything, because that'll build up more static charge. I would just recommend putting in, just if you're going to open it up and touch it for any reason, just make sure you touch like your power supply sides or a screw somewhere, because that will discharge your static electricity and prevent you from shorting on to anything on the board. But this stage right here is really important, because this is where you're going to lay out everything completely. Like I said, I'm not using the exact configuration I'm going to use, but it is fairly close. When you're doing this, the first thing that I'm going to do before I do anything else at this point is I've already measured out on the sideboard here how long it needs to be, and I did that, and I made a marking so that I know how long this board needs to be to perfectly match up to this. And like I said, there is a bit of a warp in it, a bit of a bend. So if you have a twist or a bend or a bow, is more what it's called. If you have a bow where like your board kind of like does this number, let me see if I can, that number, that's a bow. A twist is obviously if like the board's twisted, and then if you have something like warps or just all kinds of random things that could be wrong with it. But if you do have a bow in it, what you want to do is you want to situate your board so that, like I've done here, the bow is actually facing out. So if your bow is facing out, you'll have a little bit of an overlap or an overhang here where it's going to mate up to the MDF board. And the way you fix that is once you get these all put together, before you paint it, you're going to take best thing to use, orbital sander if you have one. You could really just use any kind of sander. You could use hand power if you wanted to. I prefer an orbital sander because they work fantastic. Pine is not a hard wood at all, so it sands fairly quickly and easy. So what you'll want to do is you'll just get this so that the bow is on the outside, and then you'll just get it, once you have everything attached, you'll just take your sander and you'll just go across it, and you'll just kind of make sure that everything is smoothed out there. It doesn't have to be perfect, just you want it to be uniform along the seam where they meet, because that's how you're going to get a nice good finish with your paint. So it could have a little bit of a bump here, that's there, but you're not going to notice it. So big thing is just make sure your bow is on the outside, because you can fix that easily with a sander. If you put your bowed board so that the bow is facing inward, you're not going to be able to sand that smooth. You're just going to end up with just a gap pretty much all the time. So make sure you got that nice and tight there. The other thing is how to do your joints. So on each one of the corners where the boards are going to meet, you have a couple options. One is to use a simple joint like a butt joint, which is where you take one board and your other board and you just put them together like that. That joins up, and that's called a butt joint if you're not familiar. You do also have the option of taking your board and cutting little gaps into them, which they call a finger joint. So you have little fingers, and then you have opposite fingers for the other board, and you can join them that way. Not a big fan of that myself. You can also do a dovetail, which is a crazy joint. And then what you could do, what I'm going to do, which is kind of a 45-degree butt joint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut using my miter saw. You want to make sure if you're going to do angles, you're using a saw that is meant to give you a good angle. You could use a table saw if you make a nice jig for it, but you want to be sure that you're getting a good sharp angle when you do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my board and I'm going to cut a 45-degree angle down that way. And that'll mean once it goes to that edge, I'll have the other board which will have another 45-degree angle that's opposite, and those will butt up to each other, and I'll just glue them together, and those will hold perfectly, because wood glue is some real serious stuff these days. Wood glue holds anything about where it needs to be. Now I would still recommend for joining the bottom portion, what I'm going to end up doing for that, so once I have all four of the boards put together on the sides that way, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use a pocket hole jig. And a pocket hole jig is basically, it's a thing you lay onto the side of the board, and then it gives you a slot to drill down at an angle into the board, and that leaves you a nice little pocket hole, which is not really that visible when you go to put your screw in once you're finished with it. But you put the pocket holes in, and then you screw it down, and I'm actually going to glue it and screw it to this piece of MDF here, and that'll make it a good solid contact. Pardon me. So that's pretty much how that's going to work out. If you're wondering at all why this is so much taller than these, it's because like I said, I have a different motherboard which is a bit taller, and I kind of really wanted to fit the graphics card in vertically if I could. If not, that's fine. I'll just use this riser cable, which, by the way, riser cable runs about $30. So if you need one of those, yeah, go ahead and get one. They're actually kind of neat. You can move your video card anywhere you want, which is pretty cool. Not anywhere you want, but a lot of different ways. And that's pretty much it for now. So if you have any questions, advice, please write down in the comments, and I will look over that and probably reply to you. I'm a big fan of replying to comments, so I like to reply to everything I can. But thanks for watching, and I will see you next time when I actually get started and this starts to take a little bit more shape. So wish me luck.